Jacob, what a
I
treat.
must be a
How are you,
I must
Jacob?
be a lucky guy.
I'm very fortunate. It's good to see you. How are you, Jacob?
I'm really glad to be here with you, and yeah, doing pretty well.
Excellent. I look forward to our discussion in January. That will be a real treat. So thank you for thinking to do that. I'm learning about all the individuals involved in their work, and I'm really quite taken. So thank you for helping in the Climbing Mount Sophia channel is full of goodness. I haven't due to the holidays, I've only begun, but it looks quite outstanding. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Ken's a lovely guy. I've only had one dialogue with him so far, but I got a really good sense of him and have watched quite a few on his channel. And he's been a big Viveki student and Dia Logos student, and is very keenly showing up for dialogue with his best with everybody, and that's what we
Excellent.
look for at the end of the day. And
Absolutely.
Joseph is a peer of mine who I bumped into at the Stoa some years ago,
Oh,
and
wow.
have been friends with for a few years now.
Well, that's magnificent. Well, I think Javier, good to see you. I hope it was a good holiday, and Dimitri, what a treat. And Jacob, Michelle sends her greetings, and but no, it's interesting. Just I've been thinking a bit about that of how just the very openness kind of changes the category or the nature of the dialogue that unfolds. And one of the things that can happen, say, at college is people are there, but they're not necessarily open. So the quality of the dialogue can change. And you really do, I think, see how mode transforms the very way that people engage in philosophy, right? So there's almost a way, if I'm going to incorporate Javier's thinking on timing, which I can't help but do because I think it's so lush with potential. And I enjoyed your recent Substack, Javier. Um, um, is that there's something about until there is openness like that, that the timing is not met for the engagement of like real thought or dialogos or real philosophy, right? And how in that sense the very like environment of say college can sometimes actually make it impossible to have that right timing collectively. Maybe there's individuals, but it becomes, and that actually I'd be interested in what you think. So Javier, on how the environment or the expectations of the environment or the kind of obligations of the environment can actually make it impossible to ever have right timing. Now, you did that wonderful piece where you complexified the possibility of right timing. I understand that. But it makes me think about how conditions impact timing, like the timing, when it is the right timing to engage in philosophy. So that's a thought I had, which is kind of a different dimension of these online spaces. And a reason, too, I'm always interested in kind of these meta questions about the nature of the conversations themselves and what it says, is because if the conversations online, which I think are generally new because Zoom technology is rather new, and certainly faster internet that allows average people, a lot more people to engage in these who otherwise wouldn't. If you see things occurring here that have never occurred before, then the nature of reality must be such where such occurrence can happen, right? So then that has ontological and epistemological consequences. And then before passing it on, who wants to speak? The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is the phenomenology of making a choice, which I find pretty interesting. Not just the discussion of determinism and free will. I think we've all had those discussions, but like, what is it like to make a real, like a choice? Not just like, oh, I'm going to have chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla. Now, for Javier, that may be like a really freaking real choice. So don't let me downplay that. But generally, a choice of taste versus one that has like really real consequences, but it's also not clear if those consequences are real or imagined. And to make it, it may also upset other people and it may make you look like a fool. Like, what is the very experience of a choice? Like a deep choice, because I think that phenomenological analysis is different. I have not written it, it's just something I was thinking about. So if anyone has any thoughts on anything that I've said or your own work that you've been working on, please go right ahead. I see Javier has raised his hand, so I'll pass it to Mr. Javier, and then Dimitri. Good to see you both. And Jacob, always great to see you, sir.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm happy you always like my work on timing. Um, Conditions impact the timing. Yeah. Um, so there's been this thing that I've been working on. I haven't written it yet. It's called a choice choice and chance. And I've been thinking it's really fascinating that actually a choice you make is actually a chance for another human being. So for example, we always talk about like the probability of getting money on the street, right? Or something. And yet it's funny enough, all it takes is somebody to make a choice to give money to the person asking for that income. So in this case, what becomes a choice, what is a choice for one person is a probability, is a chance for another human being, which is actually kind of like a really ironic thing. And this is something that I've been like really thinking about like in a deep way, because I'm like, okay, like we always talk about from the perspective of like, what is the probability of me receiving this thing or me achieving this thing? However, from the opposite end, it's really about making the choice to do it or not do it. So it's not even like a probability for that person, it's a matter of choice. But my speculations between choice and chance, what increases the chances clarifies I guess it makes the choice greater, is I've concluded that it has to be when the person decides to become the conditions for the other in this case. Because a lot of my work on timing is like, okay, if you can foster the conditions, you don't need to worry about the timing, right? So if you've been taught how to change a tire, you know, you can change a tire at any time, but it's only a matter of when you come across a flat tire and you can't change it. So in this case, you already hit the timing of that flat tire and you already know how to change it. But I think when it comes to real choices, it has to be something where you become the conditions for the other, where the other could not foster the conditions to meet the time. And this is something that I've been speculating. I'm still trying to think, because I do think this carries like a great risk of that demand. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
There was a lot of interesting things there, Mr. Jockin. It's wonderful to see you, sir. Pleasure. And everyone, I got to see Mr. Jockin in person the other week. It was a complete joy. My goodness. So it's a delight. Good to have you. I'll give it to Dimitri. I really liked at the end there, something that caught my attention is the idea of conditioning, us creating the conditions of choice and even chance, I suppose, for the other. Like, that's kind of interesting. What would it mean to choose to live in such a way where we positively condition, beneficially condition, or condition in a manner that contributes to right timing other people? Because we tend to just think in terms of choices as, what do I want? Yes, no, am I free to get it or not? But that's quite interesting to think in terms of also choice as conditioning oneself to create the conditions of the choices of others in a way that's good or bad. That's very interesting. Let me give it to Dimitri. Dimitri. Good to see you, sir.
Yes, great to be here. Always great to be here. Daniel, you've been on fire lately. So yeah, the work on the counter enlightenment has been fantastic. And since we're on the topics of timing, that means we're on the topic of moments as well. And that means we're on the topic of logic. Because moments progress logically, right? And what's Daniel Garner and Cado Last, what are they having these exhortations for? Well, it's about updating the logic, to go beyond the Aristotelian logic of A equals A and stay with that. So I've been working about this in my own way, and especially going into like Christian mysticism in this regard. Now, Alain Badiou has this. Wait, let me turn on my camera. Actually, I'm standing out now. I'm okay. You can't really see me anyway. I'll turn it off. So Alain Badiou, you know who is speaking, so no worries there. Alain Badiou has this theory on philosophy is basically against nihilism. Philosophy is also basically against positivism. if it's like just a plain old, positivism or nihilism, philosophy wants to get beyond that. That's what the movement in philosophy is implicitly about. Now, whatever that means for the rest, we'll leave it at that. But he says that mysticism is not an enemy of philosophy. Mysticism, actually, according to Alain Badiou, has the same form as philosophy, but they are different. So how are they different? Now, I can recommend you to read his stuff on philosophy and mysticism, but basically the way Badiou separates the two is that for Badiou, philosophy separates the affirmative from the negative, whereas in mysticism, they occur in the same moment, which would mean, that if you go to Hegel and you read, I believe he writes it in the history of philosophy, he talks about Jacob Böhme, and then at a certain point he says, by anguish is expressed self-related negativity, and therefore at once also absolute affirmation. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's the point gets through. Hegel directly equates self-related negativity with absolute affirmation. Now, this is the thing that you can't do with philosophy, according to Alain Badiou. So what does this mean? Well, that means that whatever Hegel is doing cannot fit within, Alain Badiou's framework. And Hegel himself talks about the mystical. He says, well, what used to be called mystical is what I call speculative. So I recently wrote this article called "The Mystical is Rational," writing about all of this stuff and claiming that what is left for me to claim is that Hegel's speculative philosophy is a scientific mysticism, which sounds super contradictory because it is. That's the point of it. Actually, if you read Hegel's history of philosophy, not the philosophy of history, that's another thing he wrote. Who are the first two modern philosophers? They are Jacob Böhme and Bacon. So, on the one hand, Jacob Böhme is a mystical visionary, and Bacon is a naturalist empiricist. So, how does this make sense? Well, I think Hegel is kind of like, probably maybe it's very surprising to some people, but what Hegel's doing here is showing that within the birth of modernity itself, or the Enlightenment, there is a split between the natural empiricist side and the more mystical, religious, pure faith, whatever kind of thing. So I think, that what you're working on, Daniel, is, Hegel was the first one to be a counter-Enlightenment thinker, and his whole project hinges upon it. Like to see the first two philosophers as already the first two modern philosophers to already embody this split within the Enlightenment. So yeah, and like in the phenomenology of spirit, he goes on about pure faith and reason and how insight has to be groundless, and therefore pure faith, latches on to its kind of otherworldly God and things of this nature. So yeah, that's kind of what I've recently been working on, and I think it's greatly in line with what you've been working on, and others in this network.
Well, thank you, Dimitri. I appreciate that. And, a few things. One, I enjoyed your Substack very much. Two, I haven't watched, I know, and Javier spoke with the gentleman at Seekers of Unity. He seems to have put a video out recently on Hegel as a mystic. That looks quite interesting. He's a Zebi. I believe it's Zebi.
Yes. Can I just respond?
Yes.
Yeah, so I watched the video. I was stunned because it was like posted literally a day after I posted the article. So there was like the Weltgeist making some weird convulsions moving through us. But anyway, I really love the video. It's extremely high quality, and what that guy is working on, like he works on absolute spirit, religion, art, and also the jouissance of the absolute idea. I think it's all fantastic work, and I'm talking to him right now, hoping to collaborate. He's really amazing.
Yeah, Javier had a great discussion with him, and seems like a very genuine individual. And that openness we talked about at the beginning. And I'm also, as a side note, I remember years ago when I was in my massive sociology phase, which I guess I'll admit I had a sociology phase. Where is that okay? Where I read all the sociology. And one of the things that, like, you know, we have books like Hunter, Huntington, I can list off names, Berger, you know, all of these people were talking about the incredible challenge of speaking between religions, you know, different religious traditions, where each person in their own religious traditions were able to respect the differences and yet have a serious, deep discussion, and how that had proven. And they were like, if we can't learn how to do that moving into, say, the 21st century, that's going to be a big problem. And the other language for that is first principles, I think is the other term they say, where, like, and then Hunter would say, basically, if democracy does not learn to talk in terms of first principle, it can't be substantive democracy, and it's basically doomed, is what he said. And he actually predicted in like 1992, the rise of popularism and all these other things. And Richard Rorty did the same thing, frankly. And a good professor at UVA, I saw just the other day, Mark Edmondson. He was a great modern poetry professor. And I actually suggest all of his books. He's a good man. He put out he knew Richard Rorty, and put out a very interesting essay revisiting his thought. But basically, it was the idea that if people can't learn to talk first principles, that there would be a lot of trouble. And what's interesting as another meta analysis is the fact that a lot of the online groups, even here, that I just noted, have this ability to kind of speak in and out of religion, in and out of philosophy. That seems to be indeed addressing a lot of what the sociologists were saying would be a necessary point of keeping society and the world, frankly, from falling into greater and greater tribalism. So it's interesting to note that as a kind of sociological address to a certain concern. Now, this brings us back to a common net question, the problem of spread or the problem of scale and different things. But it is something I find. And then, because as we move into 2023, something that a lot of people have been noting are sort of, I don't want to use the word practical, because practical is so loaded with kind of superiority or get concrete or whatever. But there's something about questions of sustainability of these different communities, sort of what are the lessons of these communities that can be extracted and applied on different levels to different ways of life. What are the things that have been garnered and what have not been? And that's something, and I've been thinking a lot of what I call the pricing problem of horizons, the problem of what I call economic dualism, et cetera, and then all of belonging again. But this question of the container that makes possible this I find a very interesting way of like talking about, you see it at Zevi's channel, and I think you see it here, and you see it with John Vervegen, you see it with lots of people, this ability to kind of talk from religious traditions in a manner where it does feel like everyone sees like a genuine interest in it, while simultaneously, and this is the key, and this is why Hunter and Huntington and all of them said this was so difficult, without cheapening their beliefs. Because it's one thing if we say, oh yeah, you know, Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism, they're all the same, so we can get along. Well, that was attempted, and people don't tend to like that very much because there are very real differences. But then, of course, if there are real differences, how do they relate without giving rise to some sort of conflict? So that's something I've thought quite a bit about. In regard to the counter-enlightenment, indeed, I think, you know, you have your Vicos, you have your Scotts, you have your different, all the people Isaiah Berlin talks about. And then I am completely convinced that the modern counter-enlightenment, you can see seeds of it, like really in Hegel, which is not merely a deconstruction of A as we find in postmodernity, but in a negation sublation of it into AB. Now, of course, that is not to say Aristotle is wrong. It is to say the language Cadell and I were talking about is overfit and underfit. And I think that's more useful language. And we actually need to start thinking in those terms. You know, does, say, classical logic, would we be overfitting it if we say applied it to the entire process of becoming that we see in phenomenology? You would say, yes, okay. But is it appropriately fit when we're describing the way that we think about a phenomenon and understand it? Well, yes, Aristotle is a very useful model regarding the categories of thought of the bookcase and how to understand it in relation to other things. But if we're asking the process as Hegel is, because he's very ambitious, the question of how do you think pre-category, and what is the process by which that pre-category can occur? Well, then one would have to think new thought. And so I think also for me, I think a step of almost, I want to say, maybe this is too heavy, but intellectual maturity. There's something about thinking in terms of overfitting and underfitting versus right and wrong. And those are terms from computer science. I'm easily using them incorrectly. But like, it's just like Descartes. You know, Cadell and I, we have a OG Rose tomorrow. And something like even Descartes, like everyone likes to bash Descartes today, right? Like it's just easy to bash Descartes. And don't get me wrong, I'm no Cartesian. But one, I don't fancy, you know, Descartes was really smart. That's a really smart cat. And I think the world is probably better because of his books than without them. You can say, but people misread them and did terrible things. Yeah, probably. But, you know, they misread science and do terrible things. They misread the Bible and do terrible things. Like one will never find a humanity that doesn't misread something into terror. But the problem is, it kind of seems so natural to say someone was wrong or stupid. Not that I'm saying anyone here was saying Aristotle was wrong or stupid. I mean, not that I was saying that, but there's something about the ability to go overfit and underfitting, which I guess would also just be kind of a Hegelian take in itself, right? Historical development. But then it makes me think of the Scots. That seems to be, and that, you know, overfitting, underfitting, might be something of timing as well, right? You know, when is the right time to move on from a thinker? When is it the right time not to employ a thinker? So these are thoughts I had. Dimitri, I saw you raised your hand. Jacob, feel free to speak. I see you're unmuted. No pressure, though.
Just briefly,
yes.
I felt it would be proper to presence myself and introduce myself and say that I'm glad to be here. And it's good to see you again, Javier. I'm not sure if I've been here with you before, Thomas, but it's nice to meet you. And Dimitri, I've been enjoying your dialogue with Cadell just today, just this afternoon. So feeling some continuity. And there was some really juicy stuff in that dialogue, particularly about how to kind of bring the psychedelic, mystical, dissolutive way of being into grounded reality and routine and the necessity of that. And that really resonated with my current stage of life. And so beyond that, I don't have too much yet to say on timing. I feel I've sort of stepped into a philosophical tennis match, and there's lots of different balls moving, and the balls are kind of color coded in different ways, and I'm figuring out, you know, which ones to hit and in which direction and so forth. But it seems to me that the timing of this dialogue being between winter solstice and Christmas in the new year is a relevant context, and I feel like a little more situatedness is necessary for me, particularly in the online Zoom context, even at the level of checking in as I have just now, to actually be present here in the virtual and yet real space that we're sharing here. Otherwise, I do rather feel I've kind of gotten into a stream of philosophical water, and you know, I don't know, am I supposed to just be swimming down with it or letting go into it, or am I looking for a rock to grapple onto and sort of hold on to the side somewhere? I'm not sure yet, but as always, glad to be here.
Well, it's lovely to have you, Jacob, and I love that description. Yeah, we always see what we're going to catch. So there's, you know, we throw a net down, we see what happens. So it's fun, but I appreciate that situation that you employed, and I'm yet to watch. I'm hoping to see soon Dimitri's recent talk with Cadell. I always enjoy that, and yeah, that's a fascinating topic as well. Mysticism, psychedelics. You know, Thomas does such tremendous work on beauty. You know, the topics of alterology. Then Cadell will talk about singularity, and these are all different. They're not the same, but all of them involve, if we take Cadell's language of the singularity as the point where logic breaks down, or where classical or everyday categories of understanding no longer apply. What's interesting is there's, I think, increasingly an awareness where theology, philosophy, thought in general has to think that point, incorporate that point, not run from that point. And what does that mean? What does that mean for thought? I'd say theology has, I would say a lot of religions have suffered by not really taking seriously the notion that their subject is a God of whom all categories break down before, right? Like if you take that seriously, like if you really take seriously, like, you know, if you go to church and you say, we worship God, really, that's a big deal. And like, it's like Anselm, I always find interesting with Anselm, like the way Anselm starts to pose the lower, basically a way I interpret the ontological argument, and I'd have to give the paper is basically he's like, yeah, if you're not thinking about God from your knees, you're not thinking about God. Like if you are really thinking about God, you're going to fall on your knees, basically. And of course, he's kind of tongue in cheek because it's like impossible to fully think about God, right? But there's something about the mode that brings on, and I am very interested in this connection between mode and thinking and different things. And I also know, Dimitri, I think mysticism, often different mystical traditions point to AB logic, modern counter. You will actually find quite a number of theologians from many traditions that have thinking aligned with it. I think theology can more naturally move in an AB direction if we use that point. But let me give it to Javier and then Dimitri.
You know, Jacob, usually what I do is I just try to listen to the passion of the speaking, if that makes any sense, rather than the content, because it's really funny. I meant to comment a while ago on Barnes' very awakening kind of presence when he joined one of these net sessions. And I couldn't help but kind of laugh a little bit because everybody was getting caught up in his language, but it was very funny because it was just pure passion what Barnes was speaking. Which is another paper I have to write, Passion versus Desire, but which is very close to Daniel's also a great paper on his, I think, fulfillment of intrinsic motivation versus desire, and kind of like that. So Daniel, you brought up religion and their differences. I think, and this is something I've been really thinking about, I think we need to stray away from ontological difference. Because ontological difference, you can always come into the same with. What does that mean? It means for every religion, they have a tradition, right? They have some type of ritual. They have some type of methodology to reach the divine. And so in that sense, they are the same. So I think that kind of speculative ontological difference is never, at least for me, never really helpful, because people can become dogmatic about that ontological difference. And the same thing goes with race and sex and gender and identity. It actually reminds me of Nishida's critique of Hegel, where he said, Hegel still falls into Aristotle's, the subject cannot become predicate. And I think that points to a danger, because the subject that cannot become predicate then draws a boundary around itself, and says that this is the difference. But I actually think that the real difference has to lie in the action itself, not an ontological difference. And I think this is where even Deleuze would fail, where he says, oh, just become your own flight, right? He's like, oh, just become yourself, like create your own ontological difference. But I still think that fails in a sense. So it almost seems like action has to be like the more real difference between the ontological difference. Which is something I've been speculating on. And then when we talk about Descartes and Hegel and all these sort of these ideas that we bash on sometimes, yeah, I think this always bodes well with my work on timing, right? I think timing sort of makes all universal judgments void, mainly because there's always a time for Kant, there's always a time for Hegel. The real question is it the time now for Kant or for Hegel or for so-and-so? It's these questions. And yet, ironically enough, Kant becomes the preconditions for Hegel. So he becomes the timing for Hegel to jump in. And so there's always these things that we can play with, that Descartes is never really just void because he sort of falls into a dualism. It really requires us a certain condition, a setting to which we can look to Descartes, rethink Descartes, and then which Descartes always becomes a sort of rich condition to which we are always thinking from. So in that sense, Descartes is always providing a sort of material condition for us to achieve timing. So that's why I'm kind of hesitant on, just like you, Daniel, I'm always hesitant on declaring any philosopher bad or good. It's more about studying the conditions that are present and the resources that are available. And of course, the real hard question is, what is it that we're trying to answer that is demanded of us currently? Which is the work that I was trying to do. What is the condition that allows us to receive what is demanded, to understand what is demanded in this case. But yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you, Javier. I'll give it to Dimitri and Mr. Jonkin. And please don't misunderstand me as saying that I have never bashed a thinker or said someone was wrong or different things like that. I've said many things and written many things. But over the years, I try to get better and better at seeing, because yeah, would there be philosophy as we know it, or a lot of the ideas without Descartes? Even if they're corrections, even if you need error. Now, it becomes difficult. Well, it just gets into, I think you have to have, I like the idea of kind of the historic materialism, almost in a Marxist sense, where Kant is a kind of condition that makes possible Hegel. That's kind of a funny wording. That's interesting. I think also what you're saying on religion as on the realm of action. Yeah, I think it's a kind of the question of the grip of difference, right? I mean, to hold difference, like there is difference, but it's kind of an open hand. What makes it open, because if you say no, it's all the same, you drop it and you lose definition. But then if you tighten it, you get that fundamentalism and you're closed off. So you hold it like this, and that grip is a result seemingly in the realm of action, not belief so much, like the way you act around other people and hold. So let me give it to Dimitri and Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, so about Descartes, I was surprised to read in the history of philosophy that Hegel said that Boehme and Bacon were the first two modern philosophers, because in the lectures on logic, Hegel actually doesn't even mention them, and he says Descartes is the first modern philosopher. So Descartes was, of course, the arch rationalist in some sense, and there's this great YouTube channel called Esoterica. He did a video about Descartes, and how Descartes was actually very much affiliated with, esoteric organizations, the Rosicrucians, for example. In his dreams, he read books, and he had the spirit of truth coming to him, and he had all these mystical experiences that motivated him to write the rational stuff, supposedly rationalist stuff that he did. And that means that, that's this is an example of how after Descartes, yes, he's like very much, a lot of people say Descartes is wrong, yada yada, and they like to kind of like scapegoat him as, oh, this is the point where it all went wrong. But they make him into some kind of A equals A figure, right? I think, therefore I am A equals A. But his actual emergence is AB. And I think, the actual emergence of anything, in fact, is AB. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any movement whatsoever, and there wouldn't be any speech about it. So, because to speak about something means that there's something missing, right? You don't speak about it if it's just always there and always will be there and always was there, and was never like, if things are flowing right, you don't really see it. It's when things go wrong that you notice it. To put it in this sense. So that, like, this idea of AB at the origin of everything, or the ontological difference, that's like one way that's one way of putting the idea that Hegel's philosophy is presuppositionless. That's what I think. But the crucial thing here is that it's not a presuppositionless. It's not like you're going to Hegel and you're gonna start reading him and be like, oh, look, there's no presuppositions in Hegel, finally I'm there. No, you're gonna be like, what the hell is he talking about? What do these words mean? All of this kind of stuff. But you only get to the AB through negation, sublation, or through mediation, right? So it's not an immediate presuppositionless point that you get at. No, you have to work through it, and only then do you go from presupposition to the presuppositionless state of a pure AB. Javier, to push back and be the Hegel's advocate, well, maybe not even. Like, let me just ask the question, like, where do you, because you were talking about ontological difference versus action, right? But doesn't, if we can translate ontological difference to AB, isn't this already implied in the action? Or how do you view that? Now, before I pass it on to the next, I found a passage in Hegel's History of Philosophy, and I sometimes when I read Hegel and the English doesn't make sense, I go to the German, and I noticed that actually this whole passage was translated wrong. And it got like the exact opposite point. So I will tell you the passage and then go into it. It's pretty crucial. He says, since in this advance, he's talking about where does philosophy proper start? Where does it begin? So it's about Parmenides, right? He says, since in this advance into the region of the ideal is observable, Parmenides began philosophy proper. A man now constitutes himself free from all ideas and opinions, denies their truth and says necessity alone, being, is the truth. This beginning is certainly still dim and indefinite, and we cannot explain in detail what it involves, but to explain it is precisely to develop philosophy proper, which is not yet present here. So this is kind of what I think the translator was too flabbergasted to think that Hegel could actually say such a thing, because Hegel's first saying Parmenides began philosophy proper, then two sentences later he's saying, but to explain is precisely to develop philosophy proper, which is not yet present here. I don't think Hegel's not making a mistake here. But Hegel does make mistakes, like I just told you, with the whole modern philosophy thing. No, what's happening here is that, to actually go for and look, where does philosophy proper start? Is this kind of situation of, is this kind of impossible situation that you have to affirm a certain beginning to get to the point that you notice that it's not the true beginning, so you move on to the next. And therefore, there's never really probably any beginning to philosophy. But when you get to yourself, or when Hegel got to himself, he did go for that position akin to Meister Eckhart, which me and Daniel talked about, where divine Eckhart is saying, when I speak, it's not me speaking, it's divine truth speaking, which of course is moving away from the particular, through it to get to some kind of concrete universal point. And yeah, I think this formal gesture is very important because it is speculative. So
thank you, Dimitri. And let me give it to Mr. Jockin. And yeah, Descartes, I was just going to comment. There's a few thinkers that I'm like, oh, I need to go back and reread because I'm wrong about everything. Descartes is one of them. I frankly pulled out after that talk with David and John David, Vico's New Science, and I started reading and been like, oh, there's too much genius on 2 pages to read this right now because there's a lot of things going on. Simon W. and a few other, but no, I feel that's very interesting what you said, Descartes. I had no idea about the hysteric backings of him. And I love that the fact you need to write the translator there and tell them to get their act together. So good catch, Dimitri. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. And it's a pleasure.
It's good to see everybody. Daniel, it was good to see you in person last week. It was delightful. A little bird is telling me you might see me again soon. You might. The little bird told me, but we'll find out. All right. So great. Everybody, it's great to talk to you, everyone. Javier, good to talk to you. So I actually thought of you recently because I brought it up to Daniel. There's a reading group in the Indie Thinkers group set up for Deleuze is on cinema, which is basically his Deleuze interpretation of Bergson, which I know Daniel's a big fan of. I think your commentaries on timing really line up to what Deleuze is taking from Bergson, if I put it that way. But as a side, that was just a tangent note. What I do want to point out is what you brought up about timing making the universals moot. You know, it's funny because this is in the ethics. You know, the right time is a really important moral question. So I'm just going to focus on a ethics moral side of the discussion. That's absolutely true. In fact, moral reasoning is the reason why Aquinas put prudence as ahead of wisdom in general discussions of moral reasoning, because it's the application of universals to particular situations, which is acquiring of prudence, not wisdom. So I think that's a really interesting point. So it's kind of the tension point, really, because I think a lot of contemporary ethics would generally, the most prominent feeling I've read or seen has been emotivism, really to say that people's ethical statements, moral claims, are just intensities of emotion or intensities of passion. So that's like a Deleuzian interpretation of that. And the question is that really at stake here? Or and kind of what Daniel's bringing up, by the way, on the first principles point, you know, historically, Aristotle makes it very clear. You cannot deliberate on first principles. They have to be given to you. And then you can deliberate on the means and the mode and the instruments and all that other great stuff. You know, democracy is fantastic for all those discussions. But what happens when first principles go? We're kind of running into Aristotelian limits and on ontology, on ethics, on politics, because one, on the grounds of how to reason on first principles. So if you don't have that in agreement, you cannot deliberate on it, then it would seem pretty reasonable to argue you got stuck with effectively intensities of emotion or intensities of preferences instead. That's basically what the public domain becomes. And it becomes a coercive discussion of popular opinion of who has more intensity than the other. I bring this up because that thing about the subject can't be predicate. I wrote in the note, you know, any self-reflexive statement like the transcendentals, the good is good, the true is true, the beautiful is beautiful. It seems like a tautology of absolutely no meaning. It obliterates itself. It seems like it, but I think this discussion, especially in the Bergson interpretation by Deleuze of his discussion of images and time, I think are very powerful to kind of draw out probably the apparatus of how we understand activity. Because actually, fundamentally, across the board, there's a huge problem of understanding that Eunoia, which is in Aristotle, deals with actuality. And it's weird because he gives two modes of it for potential, right? For Dumasis, which is capacity in nature. But he doesn't give that same kind of accounting for Eunoia, even though he does say in the sense it's the literal act of the building, like the person making the building is that builder doing it. That's Eunoia. But it's also talked about as this actuality of pre-existence. Actualities exist prior to potentials. So as a result, we have this kind of bizarre scenario where the whole exists prior to the parts, that the actuality exists before the potential. But yet, the thing we see empirically is an individual one act, or basically, another way to put it, what Deleuze would say is a moment of indetermination that also points out to an actual whole. And that's what these transcendental statements also say too as well. The only way we can make sense of it is on some temporal mode, it seems to be. Or at least my notes of reading Deleuze about Bergson, I apologize for taking a very long time going over all this, is we have to have an understanding of activity that relates to both what's called the act and the acted upon, so poion and passion, and as well as basically a third category, because that's usually classically what sits. Substance is the thing that does the act, right? Or is acted upon. But if we're seeing the collapse of it by these referential terms, we seem to have to come up with another way of explaining actuality that encompasses the actual one moment to moment, but also the larger kind of real reality of it at the same time. And I think actually one of the most important applications is on the question of moral principles. How can you come up with an argument of moral universals that can exist in all time, in all realities, in all potentialities, but be flexible to withstand to the particular circumstances at every single moment? That's a huge question. I don't think we have the philosophical equipment to even address that problem, quite frankly. And the alternative we get is, as I said, kind of emotivist expressions of intensities of passion and flows, and these kind of like schizophrenic divisions, basically all over the place. So I just point out, Avi, I think your comments are very powerful, and I think we're kind of rushing into the tensions of the A is A model that's been used across the board. And that's all for me, so I yield.
Well, magnificent. Deleuze on cinema is another example of something I know nothing about. And, I was about to, and then the guy, he's really nice. I really like him. Agent Swarm, I think it's Professor Terrence Black, recently put out a video saying that to understand Deleuze, you need to read Science of the the Logic of Sense, not difference in repetition. And I'm just like, oh, I guess, okay. So I guess I have to reread that. I never got anything out of that book, but apparently that's key. And he convinced me of it. I'm like, okay. So no, I'm curious on that. What you said about first principles, without them, you end up in just intensity. I think that's exactly right. And basically in that paper from Hume to Hegel, what I found is, as much as I adored Hume and the Scots on the emphasis on common life and all of that, is that it couldn't deal with the problem that worked within a first principle or shared common life or shared first principle. But what about the relation between different first principles? And basically Hunter, not that he knew Aristotle, though I don't want to say he doesn't, basically as a sociologist, what he warns, and before the shooting again in a lot of his books, is he's like, hey, if we don't figure out how to discuss across first principles and to establish moral norms across first principles, or to create nations that can handle multiple first principles, then it's all going to it's going to inevitably have to become rising intensities until there's conflict. Like he was like, that's the only way it can go. And I think you outlined that very well. And this is also then why, like, a lot of the stuff on Vervaeke, the meaning crisis, that's often just in kind of the context. Not that I'm saying Vervaeke doesn't know this. I don't want to claim that. I haven't listened to everything he said. A lot of what he's saying is the religious side of a sociological reality that is at root a result of the same loss of shared first principles, or what I call givens. And that there's a sociological consequence for this, as there is a meaning existential consequence for this, as there is a philosophical consequence for this. And it's all kind of stemmed from a similar problem of the multiplicity of first principles, or the loss of givens, which, remember, since it's impossible not for people to think without a non-rational foundation, as I like to say, or a truth or first principle, when we say the loss of givens, that means the loss of shared givens, or givens of which people just absorb as opposed to choose. But the moment you choose them, well, then they're not given because you chose them, right? So the moment you choose first principles, they're kind of strange first principles, right? So you get these weird paradoxical tensions that tend to lead to rising intensity. So what you outlined was very good, Thomas. Javier, I will give it to you.
All right. So to address some of Dimitri's, actually, I wouldn't call the ontological difference A-B. I would actually probably say the negation itself is the difference, is the pure difference. But what's funny about Nishida's work is that a lot of the charges against Nishida is that people have a hard time figuring out what's the difference between him and Hegel, which is, I think, the sort of ironic thing, because Nishida, even though he attacks Hegel, he still uses the Hegelian system. So I think using the Hegelian system is the best way to attack Hegel anyways. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like some of my thoughts. Now to Thomas, when you talked about the third category between the actor and the acted upon, so you read my article actually on this. Style is, I think, that third category. And I've been wanting to write a paper on style versus identity, because identity seems to be exactly caught between these two things, between the actor and the acted upon. Whereas style, if we actually pay attention to style itself in the more contemporary sense, it actually supersedes identity itself. When we look at like the way something is made, we say, oh, that's very like Egyptian. We're referring to like the style of it. And like it supersedes its own identity. Or when like an artist creates something and we say, oh, that's very like Picasso of you, right? We're referring to the style of the artwork. So it already supersedes its own identity. And one of my critiques about identity, at least in the more contemporary sense, is that we correlate action with motion in space. And this is what I call a hermeneutics of space. And this is where I'm trying to push back on actions being solely correlated in space. I want to think about action not as a sort of movement, but rather as a sort of quality. That makes any sense. To think quality as action, that is something that I've been really struggling with, but it is exactly what I call style. And I think style actually has the potential to be this third category where it supersedes identity and even supersedes what is the actor and the acted upon. Yeah, I think I definitely need to read Blondel for sure. Because I think some of Blondel's notions is that everybody is acting and not real action, which catches us in the identity mode between the person that is the actor and the acted upon. But yeah, for I guess, because I know Jacob and probably Dimitri hasn't read it, I wrote a decent piece on, a decently, I guess, I don't know, a short-ish piece on style versus like free will. And I said free will, like our understanding of free will is too spatial. Like, you know, me lifting up a cup, is that my free will kind of being shown, displayed here? And I actually argue that it's not. I actually argue it's more about the way you pick up the cup is actually the expression of the real truth of your free will, actually. It's not about, because what we've gone into is we've gone into too many extremes between like, oh, me moving this in space is my free will, versus it was already determined that you would move this cup by said, you know, studying your brain and genetics, right? But actually free will as style, and I keep thinking of like rap culture, for example. And I think Daniel's talked about this at certain points, like the very oppression of like Black people that creates the very rap music that we listen to today, that shows the very proof of style over, like, basically overcoming the limits. When the limit is imposed, like say the oppression, the sort of subjugation, they incorporate that limit and make it into a style. And I think it's ironic because rap culture now becomes what everybody listens to now. Everybody is actually cannot help but interacting with it in some way, facing it in some way. So I think style, in my line of thinking, becomes a very important category of thought in this case. So yeah.
Thank you, Javier, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. And yeah, no, if the system oppresses you, you're basically forced to create your own system or way of life, right? So creativity, oppression kind of leads to creativity, or else there's no hope in a way, or there's no possibility. Like Bernard, my beloved Bernard, he just around Christmas put out this piece I suggested to everyone on Bernard Hankins, his YouTube, on hope, imagination, and the connections and creativity. And basically, he's like, what else is hope but the ability to see alternative possibility? Well, then he's like, by definition, that means hope requires imagination. And he makes an interesting distinction between imagination and creativity, where imagination is kind of the mental processing of possibility, where creation is then the material realization of that. And so it's kind of like, so he's like, yeah, of course, people today don't have hope because we train them out of being creative through school, and you need creativity to have hope because you need the ability to see alternative possibilities from what is, of which are good. You know, obviously anyone can imagine you don't have to do any training, but to do good imagination and therefore come up with good possibilities, there would need to be a homing on that. So it's like, so people don't have hope, right? So when you're oppressed or the system kind of hurts you, well, then the only way to have an alternative is to become creative. In creativity, it would be interesting to say if creativity almost must emerge with a new style. Like it almost has to generate a kind of mode with it that creativity is manifest through. So that's an interesting question. And yes, Blondel is basically going to place action on the realm of the quality of things. And for him, he's kind of like, people are always talking about how phenomenon are mediated by thought you know, like the bookcase is mediated by thought into the idea. And he's always talking, he's like, really everything is mediated by action, because thought is an action. Things are acting, you know, there is action going on. The bookcase is there in space. And so action is very primary, which would then put him probably with Bergson. But let me give it to Mr. Jochen.
Javier, just to jump in, I mean, I'm reminded, this is echoing right back to my talk I gave at the Buber session, right? So I gave the analogy of literacy, and specifically in non-literary context, when boxing, like I box. So the idea of box like Muhammad Ali, box like James Toney. So if you're literate within that grammar of boxing, you know very immediately there's a, by the way, I mean, it's literally a sense of timing. It actually straight up is, because the timing and tempo of these boxers are very particular. In fact, one of the things you do in sparring, or when you're I was saying that before, like in competition in boxing, part of the dance or the engagement, it's to get the sense of the timing of the opponent, and you literally know it actually better than the opponent itself in a weird way. It's actually kind of a weird sense when you actually know the timing of your opponent. You actually know who they are. You know exactly where they are in position of when the attack's going to come, in what way, in what manner, and you actually have a kind of sense of security in that. I'm just giving you some qualitative experience from boxing matches. But anyways, the main point is that language of style, right, is very much on point. I made exactly all these points. So the idea, also the kind of redounding of a kind of exemplar or icon, that its existence and you participating in it in likeness, you actually get endowed that reality of that person. So when you instruct a boxer to box like James Toney or Muhammad Ali, there's a particular kind of mode about that. Now that could be imitative in a very kind of superficial way. That's not the best quality, or there could be ways that can actually transcend it. In fact, the best boxers kind of get at the core, the first principles, and then draw out their own style eventually. That is their identity, right? So actually, the idea of the style superseding identity is very much, I think, very accurate, and I think a reasonable, very good instinct. Yeah, I say your comment about that's when the subject becomes the predicate. Yes, the icon, I think it's the example of that. I think absolutely that's the case. Yeah, because I think I just want to just follow up that this is, I don't know if that was intention, the kind of, my talk gave you some ideas to work with, that you just came up with it separately yourself, but I'm very much in agreement. I feel like there's something really powerful there. And by the way, another very important detail of it, that style is usually generated and related to the comment about basically hip hop culture and how this worked out. A lot of times styles are generated from that kind of acted upon quality as much as the act itself, meaning your limitations, right? That you have, for example, I'll use boxing as an example. The fact that your body has a certain arm length, that you're a certain height, that you're a certain weight, you have a certain cardio condition, your joints act a certain way. These are all particular to you. And then from these, even if that's the thing, even if you reproduce the copying of some generic technique, the form of a jab or the form of a right hand, it will be unique to you because you have all these limitations or just kind of explicit, definite points about you that are individual that no other boxer will have, especially in the aggregate, in terms of all the combinations of all the multifaceted factors that makes an athlete, for example. Or in the case of in cultural objects, the cultural conditions in which music gets produced, right? That an individual artist finds himself in a particular time and place, as well as the means and access they do to act upon. So what instruments are available. Another example, I think it's Irish dance, for example. I don't know how true it is, but the point is that the reason they dance the way they do without moving their arms is because of apparently laws that were enacted at the time. That'd be another example where literally the style of Irish dance came from limitations imposed onto them. And in a way, they exceeded beyond them and made it literally a kind of an existence beyond what was imposed onto it. So just meditations on what Javier is saying. I think these are great points. And that's all for me.
Thank you, and I'm going to give it to Jacob here. And the stuff on the limits and how that creates creativity makes me think of the overfitting and underfitting, and also Mr. Ebert's talk and work. And it makes me also say, going back to things earlier, without Aristotle, you don't have this limit, this kind of way of thinking that is important as a model that then one day becomes a limit. And if you don't have that limit, then you're not going to have the creative speculative reason to start moving into other realms. So this is where we can see, say, a Descartes, a Connor, everyone who is a model, like models that are useful, then one day almost become a limit. And it's precisely at that point of being a limit that there's a generation of creative thought and new possibility. The second thing very quickly, on the question you were saying, I meant to note on ethics today, you were saying with the probability, it makes me think there's a short paper on what I call absolute moral conditionality, which is the issue that you have absolute moral categories, but it's conditional of what falls under those categories. So for example, murder is always wrong, but it is not always self-evident what examples of killing constitute murder. You'd have to be in the particularity of the situation to discern what killing is murder and what killing is just killing, right? Now that's a violent example, but that right there, though, would work on terms of discernment in the ability to meet suchness and to be there, and you still have the hermeneutical problem of interpretation. So there's something of like that I think about. And then we had our talk on the is all problem to the lack suchness, which I really enjoyed. But let me give it to, but that's a huge question you brought up on why I just want to know, but let me give it to Jacob. Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm really loving how this dialogue is developing. It feels like it's kind of caught fire in the last period, and I wanted to reflect back my own experience because I did attempt to read Dall-E's Difference and Repetition, and it was the first and only book that has absolutely defeated me in the, you know, I've prided, I don't know if I'm proud of it, but I've prided myself on, you know, when I attempt to read something to really read it, and I was wiped. Really gave up on the book, truly. And so coming into this dialogue, especially for the first 10 minutes, there was such a distinct sense of like, wow, I'm like, this is more or less the same as if I was sitting listening to people talk in a different language. Because for all of my engagement with philosophy in a participatory sense and what it means to experience wisdom, my theoretical grasp is limited, and I haven't read most of these guys. So with that being said, I had this wonderful experience of like listening, and then at a certain point it was like, oh, suddenly it went from completely unintelligible to it started to connect to my direct lived experience, which is really when it becomes vital, is when you're speaking the concept and it's coming through directly to the experiential immediacy of my life. And that feels like we've moved on to with this really interesting notion of action as quality and relatedness to style. And yeah, hope and creativity in relationship to constraints is something I've been definitely grappling with. And having started working more or less full time, I find myself with a kind of hour and a half, 2 hour window at the end of any given day. And that feels like the window in which the creative action, the creative vocational purpose can be enacted. And that's an interesting, challenging constraint, because it feels as if I need to engage in that in order to advance myself beyond the position that I'm currently in of contending with the constraints of the work that's not very meaningful and so on. And yet I don't want to turn the work of writing philosophy or creating music or what have you into task, and then make it kind of reduced and lacking spontaneity. So that becomes a really interesting problem. And the last thing that I've been observing recently with great surprise is that it's so often when I'm in the most when I'm feeling most depressed or beleaguered is when I'm suddenly having a surprise flow of creativity come out of left field. And that's been super interesting and doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but there you go.
No, thank you for that comment, Jacob. The meta structure of the conversation that you described, I think is very important to analyze that, where there's this kind of flow, and then boom, kind of a crystallization. One, if indeed there is something about this or what lots of people are doing that has some sort of insight into the structure of the conversation of which makes substantive democracy possible, then it might have something to do like that. But you see, that requires the ability, like you did. You never stepped in and said, hey guys, I have no idea what you're saying, and then killed everything, right? You allowed it to wash over you and to let it develop, right? So that's an example where everyone in the conversation has to be able to do that. But you see, we're all kind of trained, especially in, say, dare I say, America, where it's like, get to the point, get to the point, get to the point. Well, then that basically forces everyone to say, well, I believe God is X. Well, I believe this, I believe that. So there's no it's all fundamental to kind of get to the pointness. Because often, like when a conversation starts, the people involved don't know where they're going. You know, they themselves are seeing what, like this, you know, you're thinking, what have you been thinking about? And you see and what it emerges to. But that emergence can't occur unless people are open. So I think as a meta-analysis, something about that may point to what all of these old sociologists, old, I don't mean old in a bad way, but kind of traditional, you know, these great thinkers were kind of suggesting or looking for, that they could not possibly imagine before Zoom, basically, before the technology. I mean, this is the early 90s or 2000. I think Berger died more recently, but it was still a while, 10 years, maybe 5. Anyway, so that's something to note. Second, the relation between constraint and creativity and distress, I think is indeed something I experience. And actually, funny enough, I find that a lot of people who say, oh, I'm going to go have a creative retreat, I'm going to go have 5 hours of isolation in the mountains to think. I'm not saying that never works, but often, sometimes, actually, that will be they don't do what they think they're going to do. But yet, sometimes going off and having that silent can be the time where they get themselves mentally, psychologically to the place that then they can be creative. So I'm not saying they don't have a kind of role, but you know, when you say have to get to the venue, or you have to take care of things, then when you have your 30 minutes to work, you do it. You know, there's a kind of focus, right? You like, boom, you got to make it happen. And, you know, there's a lot of people today that talk about distraction and the inability to think or different things. One of the beautiful things of the pressure of constraint, and that will go a long way to keeping you from being distracted. So there's a benefit there, right? And then if you get more, and this is actually what I find, if you get in the habit of being able to focus hard, then even you develop a habit of being able to focus, and that's something we've all lost. Well, I think is easy. Well, that it's easy to lose given the technology today. So a period of constraint to regain the habit of focus is incomprehendibly valuable. Now, and then I find when you don't have a constraint, you still got the habit, and so you stop needing the constraint because you've now created yourself as an individual who has that ability. Now, to that, and then I'll give it to Dimitri and Javier, indeed, the way I avoid that, though, if I have a constrained window, say, before going to the wholesale, the reason you keep it creative is because every morning I don't know exactly what I'm going to make. But I learned that if I got up at the same time and was at the same desk and had the same basic, like, item associated, there's a term for this, like the same cup of coffee at the same time, that your brain would be ready to go. But you're never creating the same thing. And yeah, the night before, what I would do is open like 3 Word documents and put like, oh, I was kind of thinking about this, 3 different documents, but not decide which one when I woke up, and I had the focus, then boom, that one. And so there was a combination of structure and spontaneity that I found that was extremely useful. So maybe I'd have, you know, I did a lot of the Turn the World. I'd have a Turn the World. I was working on both Turn the World, Belonging Again in 2016 to 2017, a lot of short stories since 2008. So they'd have all these different things, these different folders. So there was a structure, not infinite possibility, but maybe 5 possibilities. Okay. So when you arrive at the same time every single day and your brain gravitates toward one, that's where you find, because you actually do want to systematically have focus. You want to reliably have focus. Reliability of focus is not the same as rigidity of creativity. So you want to create structures to have reliability of focus, but then in your structure, openness is part of the very structure so that your brain can go toward which of those projects or ideas it's a live act. So those are some practical questions. I actually enjoy that subject, so we can talk about it. But I think what you're pointing at is important, and that I thought that's something I've wrestled with and thought of, and I think is really important. So thank you for bringing that up. Let me give it to Dimitri and Javier. Thank you, Jacob.
Yeah, I think this is a really great and important subject as well, and it's great to hear, Daniel, how you are dealing with all of this, because I mean, as far as I know, I don't see anyone who is like as prolific of a writer about philosophy as you. You know, and you have 3 children, and I have no idea how you do it. But this is a small piece of it. So I'm getting closer. Yeah, for me personally, yeah, I'm not there. I don't know if I ever will, whatever. But for me, like I really have to not force myself. Like Zizek has this clip where he talks about that he never actually writes books. He just writes notes. And then he writes so many notes, and he's like, oh, if I just edit this together, then it's a book. And that's just also why, Zizek's books are almost, they are so super similar, except if you go to Sex and the Filled Absolute, which actually is surprisingly structured. And I guess I'm a bit similar to this. I just write a lot of notes for everything. I try to the way I try to read is whatever I read, like I have to read it and finish it. And then when I write, I also have to write notes with it. And because if I don't write notes while I'm reading a philosophy book, it's actually very hard to retain anything. It's very easy to tell yourself that you retained it because you've so-called read it. But this is not the case for your actually long-term, deeper memory. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. But like I try not to force myself, like, oh, I have to produce a video or an article every so often. No, I'm in the phase where I'm like, if I know a lot of amazing people now on the internet and also in real life, or like real life, but yeah, and then I just I want to collaborate when I get a good idea, but I don't want to force anything of it. And apart from like working on that stuff, I just try to read as much as I possibly can. So I really think it's a great topic, and Daniel, I would like to hear more about how you're doing this.
Well, you're very kind. I'd love to speak about it sometime. I'll pass it to Javier. The process of taking notes or having systems of processing books, without those, you do not develop systems of recalling. You may have memories of what you read, but it will be quite difficult to recall them, say in conversation or in the middle of a paper when boom, oh, that's what I need. So it's one thing to remember, it's something else to recall. And also, it's very important that you say have notes or things written out so that when you go to computer or the muse shows up, you have a block of marble to chisel with. It is a mistake to try to go to make something without a block of marble to chisel with. But when you have notes or you have thoughts or you have these things, you can start to connect. When the creativity comes, it can start working with something. And if the creativity goes away, there's material there that you can start editing or incorporating. Then the creativity comes back and it goes and it comes. So having material and work inside of you that you can recall and on your computer that you can incorporate is very, very much part of the process. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
It's funny. I think only now I kind of understand what Daniel goes through. Where I have literally in my phone, I have just a list of all these papers I have to write because, and they're just like one-word sentences, I mean, they're like, okay, style over identity, passion versus desire. Like I have all these things I have to write. And I've only, like I just published a piece yesterday, right? And I still have so much more that I need to do. And I finally understand how Daniel feels because every thought connects another thought, which leads to another paper. And they start thinking, wait, well, how does that connect to experience an event? And then how does passion connect to experience an event? And then you're like, oh, that's another paper. And that's another paper. And I just keep fucking going on. So I feel like I finally understood how Daniel feels in some way. He's like, dang it, I haven't got to that paper yet, but I'm there. But okay, this notion of restraint, Daniel, that you're talking about, I think this is what some of my thinking has been on slowness. Milan Kundera is definitely now one of my favorite literary authors for sure. And my reading of Kundera is actually that we need to not understand slowness as speed, because this is my critique of spatial reasoning and understanding. but slowness as the restraint to not conquer. And what does that mean? It means that boredom is actually the peak of all your conquests. You have simply nothing to do. But if you had simply tried to refrain yourself from conquering, the speed of slowness is helpful in this action, but it's actually the quality of not conquering. The intention of not conquering is actually, in my opinion, the real slowness as being, is the way to be as a slowness. And this is something that's very important, because I think identity is problematic, which is why, you know, whether I unconsciously absorbed this from Thomas's great presentation or not, probably did. You know, I think it happens all the time. And then I think it's funny that when I read other thoughts and thinkers, I'm like, oh, wow, I'm very close to Blondel, I'm very close to Deleuze without ever having reading these thinkers. My problem became that identity is a big problem. Identity is too spatialized. And it's funny because even in our daily language, we say there is, for example, this is a safe space. This is, you know, that you cannot cross this boundary with so-and-so because they'll get upset, right? So identity becomes this very invisible marker of territory that one can or cannot cross. And so this is why I started speculating, like, what could be something that could replace identity? And style was like the only option that I could do. And this was the argument that I've been trying to make, style. But I think in relation to slowness, my other work has been on passion versus desire. Now, if you look up the etymology of desire, desire already assumes an object, right? It sort of wishes, it demands. And I think psychoanalysis has done a great job on proving why desire itself can never fully attain the object. And I thought about why is that the case? And this is where it leads me to passion. Passion, in the original etymology of it, passion is actually related to suffering. And it's funny because what happens when we try to make sense of suffering? That means reason itself becomes a byproduct of passion, of suffering. That means when a man is arguing about his God, he has already suffered for his God, his beliefs, so now he must defend it. So reasoning becomes a byproduct of this passion, of this suffering. And it's funny because actually this byproduct becomes a red herring in everything else. And what's interesting is that passion then collapses into desire. Passion must make sense of itself because it's suffering, so it must attain, it must have some type of viewpoint, some type of aim to make sense of its own self, to make sense of its own being, that it says, I must desire this. It makes sense to have this desire. It makes sense that now I have a reason for why I am suffering. But what's ironic is that if you look at the, Jesus story, right? I think it's funny that we call it Jesus crucifixion, like the passion, that event as the passion. And yet some of the most famous lines of Jesus in the Bible is him saying, God, why have you forsaken me? Right? There's a sort of bewilderment of what is happening, a sort of loss of object to what the event, for why the event is occurring, even though he's already been told that this will happen to him. And so I think passion has a lot to do with this. I think what I'm trying to get at with my philosophy is that we need to dwell more in passion and slowness, which refrains us from conquering, which makes us realize that every time I have an object of desire, that is simply passion giving form to an object, which is why the object can never be obtained, because it's really passion, not desire. which again, I think psychoanalysis has a good job pointing at desire. I mean, pointing at passion in an indirect way by saying it's always desire itself that wants to be maintained, not the object. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Javier. And if anyone has any final things to say, I fear I will have to run here in a moment, but I've enjoyed this tremendously. It makes me think about the difference of, say, desiring to create and passion to create, and where one has to go through the process of basically the desire. There has to be a point where the desire dies, in a sense, and becomes a passion. Because if it's just a desire, well, then it doesn't manifest. And by definition, that would be a limit situation, right? That's why there seems to be a kind of limit creativity connection, because limit is where desire hits its limit of what it can do. And now it has to transfer into something suffer for. Now it depends on what we mean by these terms. And obviously there's, it doesn't. And funny enough, another thing about creativity is, Pei will say this a lot with that poet. Or the funny poet, I can't remember such of a be, but anyway, he always would say, don't try. And what he means by that is you don't try, you do. It's not something you try, you just do it. And what ends up happening, like when the limits come upon you, you just do. Right? Yes, that's it. Good job, Javier. Bukowski. That's it. Very nice. Mr. Vio, if you're watching this, and I forgot that Bukowski said that, I ask for your forgiveness. I am limited in my capacities, and so I was trying to create a justification for that failure. So there's something about where the limits come on and the desire hits, and then you find out if you are a being of whom just does create. It almost just comes out of you. Now, there's a certain conditioning and a certain work. So this isn't like, that could be taken as been saying, oh, so you either are or not, right? No, there's a certain high order complexity, high order causality, as I call it, work that is done to make oneself the kind of being that when the lines come in, the limits come in, creativity results. And unfortunately, though, I think we can get the impression, maybe from school, it depends, that one doesn't need to worry about cultivating those abilities until the limit situation arises. Well, that's like learning to swim once you're at the Olympic meet. It's probably not a good time. One would have wanted to have cultivated those dispositions and abilities beforehand. And it's also not necessarily necessary for everyone to do so, right? And also creativity can have many manifestations. There's creativity in business, there's creativity in farming, there's creativity in writing, there's creativity in all these things. Now, as you all know from my economics, I think creativity is the center of the development of an economic system and basically value. And without creativity, there's no technological innovation. And as a result, there tends to be a stagnation of growth. So I certainly think creativity is important, but it's very interesting to note that a limit situation tends to bring out or unveil if the conditions are already there for creativity to occur, and it occurs precisely in the context of a kind of ergo, therefore suffering in the encounter with those limits, therefore a kind of passion. And you can see, what does Jesus, what does this carpenter guy do on the cross? He does, following Christianity, he does something pretty crazy. He comes back from the dead. Right, that's pretty creative. No one done that before. That's pretty nuts. Following the story, of course. A few more things, and then I'll run. And I appreciate you, fine gentlemen. Find a good idea or your idea that starts to feel like your idea. I don't want to make it sound capitalistic or something or own it. Not that capitalism is bad. It depends. It always depends. It always depends. When you find a really important idea, like, oh, wait a minute, we talk about time in terms of space, not timing, which is time in terms of time. That actually is kind of like you're going to foundational levels and turning something a little bit. Well, if you're on foundational levels, well, that tends to impact countless issues, right? And so what you find is like, oh, wait, if we think about relationships in terms of timing, philosophy in terms of timing, writing, oh my goodness. And in fact, since all of these topics have thought about time as time and not timing, there are corrections that, here's the key, there are corrections to be done in these fields that would be useful to people. That's where the imperative to write it comes from. It doesn't feel like it's merely abstract, like, oh, I'm going to make a correction to some philosophy book from 1807 where they mistook time for timing. No, the idea becomes driving in a good way because it seems to be something that unlocks something that would help people in many different areas. And so there then becomes an imperative to do it, right? And I think that's when you find that idea, and you have to just cast your net, really, until you find it, or do the work, or talk with people, or read your book, and then you find it. Like for me, basically the phrase are the true isn't the rational. Well, once you get that rationality is organized by truth, and truth is arrived at by non-rational means, well, that unlocks, there's a lot of implications. So you find that, you start applying, and then blah, 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 and a lot of things will come from it. So there are ideas that when there's that slight adjustment, not only does it become something that opens up a lot of possibilities, but it opens up possibilities that can help people, and that can help one organize their lives in a manner that feels like they have, where they're not so lost. And it's very easy to feel lost. So any ideas that can help with that are good. And even if it only helps one person, maybe two, maybe a dog. Dogs need help too, right? Then maybe it's worth it. And so then there becomes an imperative to do the work. But of course, yes, you have all that work on your mind, yes? So I tell you what, there are very good drip coffee pots. Get one that's steel, that stays hot for hours after it originally pours. The glass ones lose their heat after about an hour. So get one of the steel ones. That will keep it in, or get some really, really good black English tea. Black tea can have just as much caffeine as coffee as well. I'm a fan of the black tea. Green tea in the morning with your coffee, ginger, tonic, a little turmeric with black pepper, honey, those things go well too, in any way. So no, so the idea of timing, I think, is quite useful in that manner. So I'm glad for it. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. I'm sorry to run so suddenly, but I appreciate it. Mr. Jochen, I hope to see you again, if it works out, of course. And it's good to see you, and I enjoyed seeing you the other day. Rivera, thank you. Jacob, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to have you all. And Happy New Year to you. 2023 will be a good year. Best to you.